Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Russia's War in Ukraine, Implications for the Politics of History in Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Anna Bazenova, and I'm delighted to chair this discussion today. This session is organized by the Eastern Department of the Institute of Central Europe. Today we have three speakers, and we will have three very interesting presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Georgiy Kasianov, who is a head of Laboratory of International Memory Studies in Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. He is an author, co-author and editor of books and many collective monograph volumes about the social, political and intellectual history of Ukraine of the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries, the politics of history, as well as theories of nation and nationalism. One of his focuses is also the study of construction of transnational European memory. Our second speaker is Dr. Przemysław Furgacz, who is a dean of the Faculty of Technical and Social Sciences of Józef Gołuchowski University of Applied Sciences in Ostrowiec, Świętokrzyski. His research interests concentrate mainly on studying international political, economic, and military relations, as well as security policy, and also military issues, Middle East problematic, and United States-China relations. Among others, Dr. Furgacz also is interested in history and in politics of memory in Central and Eastern Europe. And our last, but of course not the least speaker, is Dr. Przemysław Łukasik. He is an associate professor at the Institute of Journalism and International Relations of the Pedagogical University of Cracow. He publishes intensively on United States history, as well as on US and German relations and politics of memory. I should mention that he worked as editor-secretary of the scientific journal Remembrance and Solidarity Studies in the 20th century European history, and he was also the editor-in-chief in the scientific journal Anteportos Security Studies. So before I will start, I will pass the floor to our speakers. I would like to let our audience know that at the end of our session, we will have a Q&A session, of course. So I invite you to take an active part in our discussion after our speakers will have their presentations. You can find this Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to invite our first speaker, Professor Georgiy Kasianov, who will be talking about the Russian and Ukrainian politics of history in the context of the ongoing war. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just thank you very much for inviting me for this event. And thank you very much for sending a outline of the questions which we will discuss, and so I will follow this outline, which I believe would help me to organize my argument. So going back to these questions, just one of them is about Ukrainian national narrative and the changes in the narrative in the context of European globalization and European aspirations of Ukraine. Generally, we should distinguish between dominant national narrative, which in Ukraine, in fact, was created more than 100 years ago. Probably the best exemplary figure for this is Mikhail Grushevsky and his 10 volumes History of Rus Ukraine. And since then, it didn't change greatly, and just at the beginning of the 90s, when Ukraine became independent, this narrative was restored and became a kind of fundamental for Ukrainian renewed national narrative, for Ukrainian national identity building, etc. So it is to a great extent an ethnocentric narrative based on the idea that the history of Ukraine is the history of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. And this narrative holds that Ukrainian history extends for more than 1,000 years. This is basics which you can find in any Ukrainian textbooks, Ukrainian history textbook in history in school. So generally, this narrative remained untouched by by the most recent developments. It is basis for the national identity. However, if we speak about professional historiography, definitely, of course, we have a number of different streams, trends, etc. in professional historiography, which are either questioning this narrative or trying to expand it or to extend it or to make it more contemporary and then to modify it and to modernize it. Generally, if we speak about the idea of European integration, that this narrative contains the idea of what we could call a integrational trend, which means that Ukraine belongs to European history for centuries or even for millennium. So Ukraine history is a part of European history. It's very common to all Eastern European countries, including Poland. So and in this case, it's also nothing new. But the probably the major intrigue here is that this pro-European orientation of Ukrainian national, or let us call it master narrative, is that it contradicts the idea of Russian master narrative, which claims that Ukraine history and Ukrainian people are integral part of Russian history. And as you see in the most recent development in what Putin says and what Russian official master narrative promotes, is that Ukraine does not exist and Ukraine is a part, Ukraine is a part of Russian historical body, Russia's historical body, and that Ukraine belongs to Russian history. And then, therefore, all territorial claims and political claims and anti-NATO, anti-Western claims based on the idea of non-existence of Ukrainian national master narrative, that this master narrative is an invention of evil West, etc., etc. So all these basics should not be repeated here. It's obvious. You can read it in every newspaper or just in any Putin's speech devoted to history. So we have this controversy between Ukrainian aspirations, Ukrainian national master narrative aspirations to be part of European history and therefore world history, and aspirations of the biggest neighbor, which is now waging war in Ukraine against Ukraine. And I will go to this at answering your third question. So generally, there is nothing there's no basic changes in Ukraine master narrative in the context of European integration. Probably the main intrigue that this anti-Russian or non-Russian component is now being escalated by Russia itself. If we're going back to the second question, and this is about how to assess Ukrainian national narrative and mythologization after 2014, and then since the start of the war, if they changed. Well, to a certain extent, yes. They changed in terms of radicalization of nationalist narrative. I make distinction between national narrative and nationalist narrative. Nationalist narrative is a narrative of the history of organization of Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian insurgent army, and the how to say it, escalation and elevation of this narrative, nationalist narrative, to the level of all nation narrative, to the all Ukrainian narrative, because this narrative, nationalist narrative, was local. It was localized in Western Ukraine. However, due to this conflict, with Russia, and due to war, which started actually in 2014, this nationalist narrative stopped to be local. It was extended to the all Ukrainian level and became all Ukrainian, mostly due to the efforts of the state and certain state institutions. I would not now cover the reasons for this, I mean technical reasons, or for instance, I would not speak at this moment about actors who were interested in this. But what I would like to stress upon, that activization, escalation, and dissemination of Ukrainian nationalist narrative was a direct result of Russian aggression. And to a great extent, the cultivation of this narrative at the state level was a response to Russian aggression and to Russian hybrid war in 2014 and to Russia's aggressive full-scale war in 2022. And moreover, then I'm going from here, I'm going to the third question about about Russia's policies and Russia's attitudes and Russia's historical politics towards Ukraine. I already highlighted the one of these components is that Ukraine does not exist as a historical agency, according to Russia's master narrative. Recently, we have done another research of Russia's textbooks on history, school textbooks, and compared this to Russia's school textbooks from 2000s. These textbooks were printed after 2015, and then we compared them to Russia's textbooks on 2000s. So what we have found is that Ukraine virtually absent from Russian textbooks. All Ukrainian plots, all Ukrainian events which related to Ukraine or happened at the territory of Ukraine presented there as events of Russian history, of Russia's state history. So therefore, Ukraine just absolutely, virtually absent from Russia's history, which means that millions of Russians who came through Russian schools just do not have any, well, even simple understanding of what Ukraine is, and they have firm understanding that Ukraine does not exist as a separate unity, as a sovereign unity, as a sovereign historical actor. Therefore, if we speak about the Russia's historical policy towards Ukraine, of course, it is based on these premises, on this worldview. It is not just ideological manipulation that Ukraine does not exist. It is part of the outlook. It's very basic and very intrinsic in the public consciousness of Russians and Russia's leadership. And from here, I'm going to my final point about the use and misuse of terms like decommunization and denazification. In fact, it looks like Putin became a most ardent decommunizer of Ukraine because he and his policies provoked the process. Of course, there were also internal factors in Ukraine, but he, to a great extent, let's say, helped those who were in Ukraine, decommunizers in Ukraine, who worked on a how to put it, decommunization of the symbolic space of Ukraine in 2015-2020. Despite the fact, by the way, that according to sociology, this policy was not popular in majority of Ukrainian population, and so they provoked this because majority of decommunizers in Ukraine were absolutely sure that decommunization is also anti-Russian. It's response to Russia's policies. And then you remember this famous expression of Putin when he said, "You want decommunization, you will have it." And now he decommunizes Ukraine in terms of destroying virtually everything which was built in Soviet times. destroying the whole infrastructure which was built in Soviet times, and so during the so-called communist regime. So he is the communizer in this sense, and also he revisions the Soviet legacy in terms of borders, because contemporary Ukraine emerged in the borders of Soviet Ukrainian Socialist Republic. And now when he revises the borders, of course, in this case, he revises the Soviet experience and Soviet legacy. So denazification, the final point. It is Soviet myth about Nazis in Ukraine, and it was definitely coined to describe the Ukrainian nationalist movement of 30s and 40s. And of course, Ukrainian nationalists were presented in this Soviet myth exclusively as collaborators of Nazis. They definitely collaborated with Nazis at the beginning of war, and then part of them turned into Nazis' enemies. I mean, Bandera faction and Melnikivtsi, for instance, and some other factions of Ukrainian national movement cooperated with Nazis until the end of the war. So this was used as an instrumentalized as a kind of branding of Ukrainian nationalist movement as Nazi movement. And then this historical myth was reinterpreted and reinvented in 2000s. And then it is easily to detect that since 2004, Russian spin doctors, Russian political technologists used this idea of Ukrainian Nazis to stage a broad campaign, particularly in state-owned and state-controlled media in Russia, in presenting the Ukraine as a kind of nest of Ukrainian caveman nationalism. And of course, this was used and instrumentalized in the war since 2014. In response, in Ukraine, this escalation and dissemination of Ukrainian nationalist myth as anti-Russian movement, anti-imperialist, anti-Russian movement. Of course, it was a response to Russian aggression. So, to a great extent, we see that these two parts, the Russian imperialistic historiography and Ukrainian nationalist myth about the fighters for independence, Chevalier sans peur, sans reproche, of course, they somehow connected and they somehow enhance each other. Final point, of course, this myth about Nazi Ukraine now is instrumentalized in the context of Победобесие, or so-called cult of the Second World of Great Patriotic War, which turned from the myth to very militant myth and expansionist myth in Russia. And of course, they use it to instrumentalize this war and to present this war as a war against Nazism, which of course complete fake, and of course it is very dangerous in terms of everything, hate speech, and it turns into kind of genocidal thinking when Ukrainians presented as those who are just dehumanized and are that have to be just eliminated from the surface of the earth. So these are all these major points. I hope that I highlighted the questions you have posted there. Thank you very much, and I am open for further discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Kasianov, for really inspiring presentation. And now we will move to the second speaker, and then to the third, and then we'll have our discussion. So it's my great pleasure to invite our second speaker, Dr. Przemysław Furgacz, who will be talking about the Polish-Ukrainian disputes over history in the 21st century. So we will be very happy to hear your presentation. The floor is yours.
Hello, I hope you can hear me quite well. I try to be relatively brief and succinct. Actually, there is one very big and serious disputation over history between Poland and Ukraine in the 21st century. It is the dispute that basically comes down to the assessment of the Ukrainian insurgent army or UPA-UPA. In Poland, the Ukrainian insurgent army is widely regarded by historians and society as the extreme far-right, fascist criminal organization that is responsible for murders, brutal murders of some between 100,000 and 120,000 Polish civilians, primarily in Volhynia and to a lesser degree in Eastern Galicia over the period of 1943-1944. In Ukraine, Ukrainian society, as a matter of fact, is also divided in its assessment of the Ukrainian insurgent army. To make long story short, in general, Western Ukraine perceives more positively the Ukrainian insurgent army, whereas the perception of the Ukrainian insurgent army in Eastern Ukraine is much more nuanced. Inhabitants of Eastern Ukraine have more reservations regarding the perception of UPA. And the middle central Ukraine is, let's say, in between these two opposing attitudes posed. However, in general, we can observe that over the last 3 decades, step by step, this process of glorification of the Ukrainian insurgent army in Ukraine, initiated politically by President Viktor Yushchenko, is progressing. And consecutive Polish governments, Polish society is disappointed with it, are disappointed with it. This process is not perceived positively in Poland in general. Ukrainian historians, majority of Ukrainian historians treat the Ukrainian insurgent army as an organization that, let's say, fought actively for freedom and independence of Ukraine during the Second World War. Some of them also put attention, stress episodes of collaboration with the Third Reich. But at least Western Ukrainian historians emphasize or perceive these massacres in Volhynia in 1943-44 not as ethnic cleansing or even genocide as it is perceived in Poland, but rather as a war, a Polish-Ukrainian war. Also one of the subject of dispute is the number of victims. Ukrainian historians claim that actually the number of Ukrainian victims of these events were higher than given by Polish historians, more than 10,000-15,000 Ukrainian victims. And in turn, the number of Polish victims of these murders, atrocities, is lower than given by Polish historians. Bear in mind, we should be aware, we should realize that Poland is engaged to a lesser or higher degree with different miscellaneous, various disputations over history with many other countries, primarily the Russian Federation, Israel, Germany. So this Polish-Ukrainian dispute is not something unique, unusual in this part of the world in general. It is also not the most, I would say, severe or renowned in the world. In general, I must say that non-Ukrainian, non-Polish historians have have assessment of UPA, of the Ukrainian insurgent army, closer to Polish attitude. This collaboration of UPA is outside Poland, Ukraine, more often emphasized, stressed, and highlighted by historians. We can see that to some degree, Ukrainian government this year began to, let's say, calm down this dispute with Poland. For instance, a few days before Polish national holiday, Independence Day, this year, Ukrainian government issued a permit for Polish side to conduct archaeological search and exhumation works in some graves in Volhynia region. Polish diplomats tried to gain such permission for many years, and as Vice Minister of the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marcin Przydacz of the Republic of Poland, opined this act is a serious change from how Ukrainian authorities had dealt with this issue, this problem in the past. In my humble opinion, it is an act of, let's say, gratitude, maybe I can use this word, for the quite significant, very significant assistance, military, diplomatic, to some extent even economic, given by Polish authorities this year for Ukraine, which, as we know very well, is repelling Russian aggression this year. So it seems to me that the Ukrainian government would like to calm down this dispute slightly, to show that we are open for some dialogue on this matter. And as a matter of fact, against the background of what is happening right now in Ukraine, these disputes over history are third-rate disputes. They are not very important. Nowadays, the challenges that the Ukrainian nation must face are much more serious, severe, and engagement in some unnecessary disputes over the past are simply not necessary nowadays. And I would also like to stress that this critical approach toward the Ukrainian insurgent army is also shared by, for instance, Israel. And despite the fact that Poland and Israel were involved in very renowned, well-known in the world, other disputation over history in recent years, in June 2019, Polish and Israeli ambassador jointly issued a joint protest against erection of some monument celebrating one of UPA soldier, officer of the Ukrainian insurgent army in Ivano-Frankivsk. And that's also, I think, worth mentioning. Moreover, what is very interesting in the context of ongoing war waged by Russia against Ukraine is the fact that the Russian Federation is trying to take advantage of this Polish-Ukrainian disputes over history, is going to benefit. As a matter of fact, it is realizing this policy of so-called divide and rule. Ancient Romans used to say, divide et impera. And it is nihil novi sub sole, nothing new under the sun. This policy has been incessantly, consistently executed, practiced by Russian Empire for many, many, not decades, ages, to set Ukrainians against Poles and set Poles against Ukrainians. It is a quite characteristic, typical element of Russian policy in the past ages. And one example of it, Sergei Naryshkin used to, in his public expression statements, used to raise this topic issue. A week ago, even Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin publicly also said that some Polish nationalist elements see of regaining Western Ukrainian territory, which was given by to Ukraine by Stalin, and he has no doubt about that. So we can see such a narration in the expressions and statements of prominent Russian leaders, including even the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And that's very characteristic that Moscow, the Kremlin, tries to insert a wedge between Ukrainian government on the one hand and Polish government on the second hand, between Ukrainian society, Ukrainian nation, and Polish nation. And it is Kremlin resorts using this dispute over the Ukrainian insurgent army. Moreover, I would like to say that there are also some other minor disputations, like, for example, about massacre in Uman in 1768, the assessment of Bogdan Khmelnytsky as a historical figure, and also about so-called Operation Vistula, that basically brought down to forced deportations of Ukrainian civilians that used to live in the territory of contemporary southeastern Poland. These deportations were conducted between 1947 and 1950, but these disputes are minor in comparison with the disputation over the role, significance, the assessment of the Ukrainian insurgent army. Why, for example, Polish politicians do not deny that these cruelties within the frameworks of Operation Vistula took place, and it was a crime conducted by Polish communist government at the time. In my opinion, we are going to see these arguments over history between Poland and Ukraine eclipsed, calmed down, eclipsed in the light of what is happening right now. Much more important, germane, relevant events, developments for both states and nations are happening right now. And these events, developments, very aggressive, belligerent, expansionist Russian policies simply tightening the mutual relation of Poland and Ukraine is making both nations closer to each other. Okay, I think that I end here and give chance, opportunity for other people to express their views. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. And now, as you see, we are moving from east to west. And the next speaker is Dr. Przemysław Łukasik, who will make his presentation on Russian invasion of Ukraine and Germany's culture of memory. The floor is yours. Can you unmute yourself? Or...
Hello. Hello, 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 hello.
It's
better. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for invitation. Thank you very much for presentation. I will start with my PowerPoint presentation. Yes, yes, okay. 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 Subject of my presentation is Russian invasion of Ukraine and Germans' culture of memory. And on the first slide, you can see a photo taken in the first days of the march. As you see, this is a photo taken in the photo of the memorial situated in a Treptow Park in Berlin, Red Army memorial. Very symbolic photo, because we see the Soviet soldier on the left hand, he's carrying a child, girl, and in the right hand he has sword crushing Nazi Germany symbol, swastika, and as you see, red slogans sprayed by unknown persons against the war in Ukraine, against Putin. So I think very, very symbolic photo, as I said, from the first days of the March 2022. In brief, I hope you see the next slide. Ukraine through German eyes. Yes, yes, okay. In short, I would like to briefly say something about perspective of Ukrainians and how they were perceived by Germans before February 2022. In general, we have to say that from perspective of German society, Ukraine was a kind of unknown country, and in generally Ukrainian topics arousing attention in Germany. It was historic Chernobyl power plant disaster, or mass murder of Kiev Jews in Babi Yar in 1941. This image of Ukraine was not so clear. Many journalists expressed their opinions that Ukraine is not as transparent as many Baltic states, like for example Estonia for German society, and even there was such a opinion that if Ukraine was as transparent as, for example, Estonia, it could easier fight for military aid from Germany. The events of Maidan in winter 2013 and 2014, it was turning point in I think in German perception of Ukraine. Sometimes members of society, German society, were comparing these events of Maidan with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the next slide. Of course, the Putin's invasion of Ukraine was perceived as an end of the West hope for common way of humanity and the end of the old world order. This expression is expression of Herfried Münkler. Herfried Münkler is a well-known German political scientist. He's author of many books, for example, Die Deutschen und ihre Mythen, Germans and their historical myths. And according to Herfried Münkler, war in Ukraine was and is a proof that the Europeans are in the midst of new Cold War 2.0. And according to Münkler, this new Cold War is permanent struggle for spheres of influence. These conflicts may lead to the general major war. So, according to Münkler, the first task for Europeans is to make that to ensure that this conflict in Ukraine won't spread geographically. And of course, this perspective of Herfried Münkler should be analyzed with accompany with German pacifism. Of course, German pacifism has a long tradition. It's of course the result of the Second World War, and of course the time of Cold War, where two German states to the history of the two German states. Of course, the German people from both states during the Cold War era were afraid that competition between the Soviet Union and the United States will lead to a Third World War, and in the near or far future, this will end with battleground. That Germany will be battleground of such a Third World War. So after February 2022, great debate was initiated in Germany, and the Germans presented highly restrained position referring to question of military aid for Ukraine. I could refer also to, for example, opinion of former president of the German Evangelical Church, Margot Kassmann. She warned that more weapons will not create more peace. NATO is equipped many times over in relation to Russia. So in this debate, pacifism is on the surface. And also, if we refer to the surveys, to the opinion polls, we have proved that German society in general is very pacifistic. According to the survey to the Deutschland trend, 63% of Germans fear the country could be dragged into war, and almost 30% want to limit arms supplies to Ukraine. Of course, according to the survey by the Allenbach Institute, far more reluctance to support Ukraine is in the former German Democratic Republic. German aid to Ukraine, if we analyze funds transferred by Germany to Ukraine, it's almost 2 billion euro. It's mainly it's also its military equipment and non-military equipment, ammunition, radars, drones, but also highly valued air defense system, Iris or Gepard anti-craft guns. German politicians, as well as European Union leaders, want to create a Marshall Plan for rebuilding Ukraine, and of course, Germany hosting refugees, war refugees from Ukraine. It's over 500,000 women and over 300,000 children, over 150 Ukrainian children are in German schools. Of course, Germany support Ukraine on political level. There was support for United Nations declaration, which was condemning Russian attack on Ukraine. Also, Germany criticized the referendums that annexed the eastern regions of Ukraine to Russia. If we have to refer to Russian-German complex relation, we can use kind of licentia poetica and say that the ghosts of Stalingrad are still haunting German conscience. Sometimes relations between Russian and Germans is presented as a conflation of guilt, responsibility, and gratitude. We have to remember that, of course, the Germans started the Second World War, and as a result, 27 million Soviet citizens, included 8 million Ukrainians, lost their life, and of course, Germans remembers that fact, that historical facts, and but of course, the Germans feel a very strong sense of gratitude, especially for the Soviet consent to the peaceful reunification of the Germany, and this is still present in German politics. Of course, Russian invasion of Ukraine destroyed the current policy, German policy toward Russia. Wandel durch Handel, for example. So it was it is the old German idea to try to democratize, to make more democratic authoritarian political system in Russia through economic exchange of goods, and this plan failed, as well as energy which was planned to use German energy resources to initiate ecological change in whole Europe. Also, at the beginning of the 21st century, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and Gerhard Schroeder, they initiated such a project called Petersburger Dialogue, and the main aim of this project was to remove all obstacles to Russia and German cooperation, but also overcome some ideological, historical differences and stereotypes. And the newest information from German media is that the whole activities of this Petersburger dialogue in 2023, all planned events was cancelled or suspended, which is very interesting from a perspective of this complex relations. Of course, the topic of the debate in Germany about removing some of the Soviet memorials from public places, it was started in 2014. Of course, after February 2022, there is continuation of this debate. In Germany, we have over 1,000 Soviet monuments. Most famous, I think, is Soviet War Memorial at Treptow Park in Berlin. And as we see, one of these monument with this red slogans. On this picture, in this slide, we see also that one of the Soviet battle tanks was covered with Ukrainian flag shortly after the war in Ukraine began. Of course, however, the Germans did not took any active steps to remove Soviet monuments, and there's only one small change at the moment. We can see the building of the Karlshorst Museum. This is of course the place where Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed act of capitulation of the Third Reich, and this museum was renamed. Before it was named the German-Russian Berlin Karlshorst Museum. Now it's only Berlin Karlshorst Museum. On this slide, you can see a quote from the director of this museum, who said that currently it's very hard to as a result of the war, but not only, it's hard to find some common, of course, narrative about the Second World War. Before the unification of the Germany, both German states signed agreement with the four powers, including Soviet Union, that they will retain and care for these Soviet monuments, and that's how of course Germans are trying to explain why they not removing this memorials in nowadays. Okay, I think this is the main part of my presentation, and of course I will try to answer to questions maybe at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. And now we're moving to discussion. I prepared some questions to you, and in fact, other questions are, of course, they appeared during your presentations. Professor Kasianov, I would like to thank you for distinguishing between national and nationalist narrative and talking about that issue. I would like to ask you about the Russian perspective. You mentioned about the non-recognition of Ukrainian master narrative by Russia. was it the everlasting story, or did this non-recognition lasted since 1991, or maybe there were some periods of half recognition or recognition maybe in the 90s, or it was only the story about non-recognition? My second question goes to Dr. Furgacz. How do you see the possibility of resolving this Gordian knot of the Polish-Ukrainian dispute over these difficult pages of the past you were talking about? Now we are in the process of ongoing war, and the Polish side, of course, has high expectations regarding Ukraine. At the same time, I think there is an atmosphere in which it is more difficult to talk about Volhynia, for example, because Ukrainian side is a victim at this moment today. And you also mentioned about this in your presentation. So can we say that in the context of the war, there are more chances for Polish-Ukrainian understanding of this tragic past? That is my question. Are there some? Could there be some changes? Yes, this in the context of this tying together Poland and Ukraine during the Russian aggression. And my third question goes to Dr. Łukasik. Maybe it is a little out of your presentation, but I think we can also include it in our discussion. I just wanted to mention that at the very end of November 2022, so practically some two weeks ago, even less, Germany's parliament has declared the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s, again, genocide. Green Party lawmaker Robin Wegener told Parliament, citation, "The killing by hunger also had as its aim the political repression of Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian culture and language." And he and also other lawmakers said that the parallels with today are obvious. So does this signal some changes in the Germans' culture of memory from your point of view? And the other question is about the transformation, possible transformation of iconic model of memory in German. Is this transformation now possible? How do you think? And as you know, up to now, Nazism was an absolute evil, and Holocaust was absolute tragedy, yes, in this model. And what Ukraine and Russia are within this model? Thank you. Maybe we'll start with Professor Kasianov.
Thank you. Well, that's we have to distinguish between history and memory here first, because if we talk about the development of professional historiography, definitely the controversy over Ukrainian master narrative and Russian master narrative emerged in the end of 19th and beginning of 20th century. There were historiographical disputes in the middle of 19th century, starting with Maximovich-Pogodin debate and moving on to further debates at the end of 19th century. But the major foundation for this is that Ukrainian master narrative emerged as a national master narrative in the end of 19th century. Russian master narrative emerged as imperial master narrative, transnational, supranational, whatever. So Russian historical consciousness started to be, in modern times, started to be formulated in imperial terms, while Ukrainian national consciousness in historical terms started to be formulated in national terms. So it was national master narrative against imperial master narrative. And then this is why they were incompatible in any case. So that was part of so-called national revival movement in Central Eastern Europe in the second half of the 19th century. However, we should admit that Soviet power admitted and recognized Ukrainian national master narrative. It turned it into Ukrainian Soviet national master narrative, and then it existed in two forms. In diaspora as a national master narrative, and in Soviet Ukraine as Soviet national master narrative. And then Soviet power institutionalized the ethnic component of master narrative, just recognizing certain borders, etc. However, there were also periods of so-called what they call Russification in Ukraine, particularly in the second half of 70s and 80s of the last century. So then Ukraine history was marginalized. It just is a part of common Soviet history, as a kind of ethnographic variation of common Soviet history, because the strategic goal was to create a new historical entity, Soviet people. So at the last years of the Soviet power, a Ukrainian national master narrative in its Soviet form was marginalized. What we see now is that Putin goes back to this imperial master narrative. It is very obvious from all his speeches, including recent references to Peter the Great, to the Catherine, to Alexander Nevsky, etc. So all basic elements of imperial master narrative are recovered. And then, of course, they go into a sharp contradiction with the Ukrainian national master narrative. And definitely this is the ground for bigger conflict and more large-scale conflict, which in fact, you rightly mentioned this, it is existential conflict. Russians perceive, Russian elites and political ruling class perceive existence of independent Ukraine as an existential threat to Russian history, to Russian historical body, and to Russia itself. Ukrainians, not just elites, but the whole people now consider Russian vision of history, and based on this politics based on that, as existential threat to Ukraine. And this existential threat is not just kind of academic discussions, it's this threat just embodied in the shelling, in bombing, and in occupation, and in genocidal practices in occupied territories. So we see how history is taken into action and becomes a kind of element of, in fact, of the clash of outlooks, because Ukrainian national master narrative is about the future. It is about the very existence of Ukrainian nation. Russian master narrative based on imperial past is about the past. They want to bring Ukraine to the past, when Ukraine really did not exist as a sovereign entity. And Russia, in 19th century Russian elites also denied the existence of Ukrainian culture and language. Well, famous Valuyev phrase about Ukrainian language never existed. So that's just a kind of motto of contemporary politics of Russia.
Thank you for that, for your perspective. So we move to the second question, Dr. Furgacz.
Thank you very much for this question. As regards the possibility, chance, occasion of solving this disputation over history, I think that it can be done only during peacetime, after the war. First of all, that's why I must, at the beginning, highlight, stress, and accentuate it very strongly. I think that one of the possibilities to how to solve it is, for instance, to change textbooks, both Polish textbooks for teaching lessons of history in Polish elementary, high schools, university schools, and also Ukrainian textbooks. For instance, in teaching history, maybe after the war will end, maybe, for instance, more information should be dedicated to how badly, inappropriately, Ukrainian minority was treated in the interwar period. And for instance, as far as I know, nowadays in present day Ukrainian history textbooks, this subject matter topic of Volhynian massacres is not a very popular, or is described, written in a certain narrative narration. Except for that, apart from this, I also think that in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, Ukrainians will erect monuments not of some Ukrainian insurgent army soldiers, but these soldiers who right now are waging the war with Russia, and they are dying for the freedom, independence, territorial integrity of their motherland. I think that in future, it's quite possible, probable, and likely that Ukrainian governments will put much more attention and emphasis on celebrating these soldiers who currently fight. So there will be alternative to Ukrainian insurgent army. And nowadays situation is even much less controversial, because these people have been basically drafted to Ukrainian army to repel the foreign aggression. So these soldiers are much less controversial than the heroes of the past of the Ukrainian insurgent army. I believe that this is a way to tighten the conditions, but in general, I think that nowadays, due to natural reasons, common enemy, because the Russian Federation with its very aggressive foreign and security policy is broadly regarded by Polish people as a serious threat, danger also for Poland, if not in short term, at least in mid-term. So I think that joint common enemy, foe, is a factor very uniting both nations, Ukrainian nation and Polish nation. Okay.
Thank you. And can I take into account, Professor Kasianov, your field of expertise about textbooks, that also this issue was mentioned by Dr. Furgacz. Maybe you would like to add something to enter the discussion on this issue about the war, the context of the war, and are there more changes for Polish-Ukrainian understanding of the tragic past?
Well, I can comment only on the textbooks which were published after 2018, because in 2015, 2016, Ukrainian schools started to move to new standards, which are suited for 12 years cycle of education, of secondary education. And then the textbooks started to be changed, and the history of 20th century studied in 10th and 11th grades, and then these textbooks were readjusted for these purposes. And I can admit that these questions which were commented by Mr. Furgacz, that these questions unfortunately came into in my opinion, not into right direction. There are two trends there. Well, generally three trends. One trend is, and it's very few, it is balanced approach, just to speak about this as a mutually unrewarding conflict. And the second trend is to speak about this force from 30s and about anti-Ukrainian policies of Druga Commonwealth, Polish Commonwealth, and a Second Republic. And the third trend is the most dangerous, I believe. It is relativization of the events and relativization of crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists against Polish civil population, and even sometimes even revisionism. Some authors even promote the idea that probably Poles deserved it. So, and this is awful. And it's not all textbooks. It's concerns about, well, the major corps, because we have, well, I have analyzed about 10 books, 10 textbooks. And so there are different trends. There is no unanimity among authors, and nevertheless, it is most general trend is to excuse your own side and to put blame on the other side, which I don't like personally very much.
Thank you for your precious perspective. I think it will be it is good that our seminar will be also available afterwards, and people can hear your thoughts. Thank you. And so we go to the third question to Dr. Łukasik.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for your two questions. I will try, of course, to answer it. First question was about the German Parliament's declaration that Holodomor famine was a genocide. Of course, it is very important symbol of support for Ukraine. Of course, I think thanks to this declaration, for sure, Holodomor became will be discussed, and of course will be better known. But of course, we can add also information about Russian reaction. Russia said that German parliament's move, it was kind of anti-Russian provocation, and that German want to whitewash its Nazi history. But I'd like to remind that in 2009, European Parliament has designated a very important day, a European Day of Remembrance for victims of Stalinism and Nazism. And this day of course refer to the historical event of Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact of 23rd of August 1949. This day is becoming part of the common European historical memory. Of course, the biggest problem, I think, is still low awareness of historical events among German society. In my opinion, political declaration are of little importance without such an impact on a greater historical awareness of society. And of course, this is the big challenge for memory, to transfer a light dispute into greater historical awareness. Sometimes I could use a Polish example in Polish-German relations. Polish government tries to improve historical knowledge of German society about Poland and history of Poland during Second World War, founding such institutions like Pilecki institutions. They operate in Germany, and they try to explain German society this problem. So as I said, this is a very big challenge for memory to transfer this sometimes allied dispute into greater historical awareness among the whole society. And your second question about transformation of I think it seems to me that this process is taking place, and I refer not only to this declaration from 2009, but we have to remember that the war in Ukraine means thousands of Ukrainian refugees in Germany, and this must evoke memories in the German historical consciousness. Let's remember that as a result of World War II, 75% of Germans had to change their place of residence after the war, and it seems to me that this has the greatest impact on the German psyche, and may make the historical experience of Central and Eastern Europe enter the minds of German. As I said, in Polish-German relations, Poles try to facilitate this process by creating institutions like Pilecki Institute, and operate and bring the German history of Poland closer. So I think, of course, it takes time to put memory of the Central and Eastern European nations to the minds of the European societies, but I think that this process is in progress. So of course it will last long. Thank you. I think I hope I answered your question.
Thank you for your perspective. Maybe I would like to add something, Professor Kasianov or Dr. Furgacz, some your vision of the issue. Maybe the end of my question, what Ukraine and Russia are within this new model. Maybe we can take it wider, not only in Germany, but also in the European context, and maybe also to Professor Kasianov, who is a specialist in creating European memory, yes, the all European memory. Maybe you can, it will be interesting to hear your perspective, and also as a perspective of Dr. Furgacz, if you would like.
Well, I would, in my opinion, it's a little bit sad that in general, Ukrainian historiography has an inclination, a tendency from one extreme to turn to another extreme. I mean that Soviet lies, to some degree, are replaced with far-right lies nowadays. It was very sad what Professor Georgiy Kasianov mentioned, that in some textbooks, even such radical opinions are expressed, or assessments about this Volhynian massacre. I believe that Ukraine in the next years after the war will end, we still do not know at what time, will be heavily focused on reconstruction. This war so far lasts 10 months, but the devastations, destructions, damages, blows dealt to Ukrainian economy are so serious, severe, that the process of reconstruction will last at least 10 years, not 10 months. And as regards the narratives, history politics in the European Union, it is very anti-far right, anti-fascist, anti the Third Reich. And there will be, I think, no tolerance for glorification of the Ukrainian insurgent army in European mainstream in the European Union. So we will see how it will be evolved, but I must say clearly and without mincing my words that in the European Union, this narrative about the Ukrainian insurgent army is much more similar to the Polish-Israeli point of view than to the point of view or viewpoint presented by some Ukrainian historians.
I would add something to this. Generally, first of all, about this Bundestag declaration about the Holodomor as genocide. It's the end of a long story. I was personally involved into this also because in 2020, I was a part of scandal, of diplomatic scandal, when the ambassador of Ukraine to Germany, Mr. Melnik, personally demanded that I would not be a part of of scholarly seminar devoted to Holodomor because he believed that I was a Holodomor denier, which was pretty funny. I don't know where he took up this knowledge about me, but generally that was a sharp question because Ukrainian community in Germany supplied a petition to Bundestag to admit that Holodomor was genocide. It is purely political enterprise, which has nothing in common with the academy and with professional scholarship. So it is absolutely clear that Russia's war against Ukraine, contemporary war, influenced this decision. And now this history is over. One of the heavyweighter of European Union, Germany, admitted that it was genocide. It is a great win for Ukraine, but it is well, it's not the loss, but it's a kind of blow on professional scholarship. And so, well, I would like to admit this as a success of diplomacy or of external policy, but it is not a success of historical scholarship. At the same time, if we speak about the prospects, definitely this decision is important in terms of inclusion of Ukrainian politics of memory and Ukrainian memorial space into all European memorial space, because it is true that generally Europe knows very few about Ukrainian history and about Ukrainian memory. However, it is also quite controversial because if when we analyzed textbooks histories in history textbooks in France, Germany, Poland, and UK, and we have found that, for instance, Holodomor is one of the central topics in this textbook. So history of Ukraine presented in European textbooks as a sequence of tragedies, as a sequence of failures, as a sequence of very negative events. And we saw this also on the case of Germany, which was presented by Mr. Łukasik. So we see this tendency, and I don't think that it's the better way to represent Ukraine as Ukraine through the history of contemporary and permanent losses, tragedies, failures, etc., etc. So this is one part. And the second part of all this story is that if you expect that European Union somehow would influence what's going on in Ukrainian politics of history, the European Union already did it several times when Bandera was awarded the title of Hero of Ukraine. So they expressed deep concern. Then, among some other actions, also they expressed concern. This is the only tool which they can apply. That the European Union and European institutions like Council of Europe or like other things which deal with the history textbooks like Euroclio, which is non-governmental institution but works with the European Union structures, they all consider this as a sovereign politics of sovereign countries. So therefore they're quite reluctant in imposing some kind of action on them. They can suggest, they can advise, but there is no institutional mechanism to influence these policies at the national level. So then, if you look at this from this perspective, I don't see real perspective of real influence of European Union structures on what is going on in the Ukrainian politics of history. And the only real alternative to this, which I like as a suggestion, is that this new war will bring new heroes, those who, regardless of their political orientation, defended Ukraine, and there will be new generation of heroes, of heroical myth, etc., which would replace this to a great extent, extremely controversial myth of UPA and OUN as a superheroes and super champions of the fight for independence. There were a lot of other fighters for independence in Ukraine with much less, less controversies about them. So this super culture of cult of OUN UPA, starting from 14, as I mentioned, it was a reaction to Russian aggression from one side, and from other side, it was a concentrated effort of certain group of people who came to power in Ukraine, particularly to the segment of politics of memory, and they do their best to promote it to all national level. But I can assure you, it is not this cult is not the expression of opinion of the whole Ukrainians. It's just just about certain segment of society, and also about lack of knowledge. It is mostly about mythologization of public consciousness, not about real knowledge about the matter.
Thank you for valuable thoughts. And since we are almost out of time, I would like to ask you all to briefly, in 2 maximum 3 minutes, to answer the question about what challenges the Russian-Ukrainian war, this ongoing war, terrible war, is likely to pose the memory politics in Central and Eastern Europe states. And so challenges. And the second question that is connected to this, what could be the main trends of memory politics in this region in the near future? Maybe it will be right just to divide respective to your countries of interest, Russia, Ukraine, and also Germany. Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and Germany. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Łukasik, just to change the order of answers.
Okay, so impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on German historical politics. I think that it's from German perspective, it's easier to remove some, for example, battle Soviet tanks from memorials or even Soviet monuments, than change way of thinking and change historical memory. We can see, I think, the great interdependence between Russian and German historical memory, in which the Soviet Red Army is the hero who liberates Germany from Nazi occupation, and from this point of view, it will be hard to change it. I can quote one of the German historian, Wieland Giebel, who expressed his opinion that no tanks should be removed from these Soviet memorials, and he said they are because Germany started the war, and as a result of that, 27 million of people in the Soviet Union lost their lives. So I think this is a great challenge for German historical memory, because this memory is kind of stuck in a narration in which, as I said, the Soviet army as well as the American army made this liberation, and so this is very difficult. But who knows, in the future, maybe I think the impact of the presence of the Ukrainian refugees may be such a important impulse to change this attitude. But of course, we need to have time to see this process.
Thank you, Professor Kasianov. So, Ukraine, Russia, challenges and perspectives, trends. Can you unmute yourself?
That's very obvious that it was antagonistic. Now it's extremely antagonistic. So, and the major impact is that now, for instance, we had a in Ukraine. I could speak about Ukraine. It's nothing to speak about Russia. It's absolutely obvious that it is now serves for foundation for a genocidal thinking. So I would not comment it. It's obvious and nothing to comment. As to Ukraine, we see that obvious tendency for the radicalization of anti-Russian moods and anti-Russian rhetorics in both in the politics of history, which is a natural outcome of the Russian aggression and Russian war. But if we speak about professional historiography, I see that a very dangerous tendency to exclude Russian segment from research, which would be very short-sighting, because if it's enemy, you should know your enemy very well. So you had to enhance studies of Russian politics of history. But if you look at what is going on now, for instance, there is a law draft submitted by members of parliament recently that Russian-speaking publications, publications in Russian, should be excluded from the academic circulation. This is well, I don't know how to call it. Well, it's very harmful. It's very dangerous tendency, and it is perceived as a kind of politics, and should not be this kind of politics. If you want to fight your enemy, you have to know this this enemy perfectly well. If you don't do this, so you might have real problems in the future. So, as I see, the tendency is antagonization of the politics of memory in these terms. And another side effect of this, that those who want to use Russian literature, Russian history for their research, they might go to the zone of danger, because they could be perceived as a potential collaborators, potential, well, those who are not well, considered as a big hours. So this is, unfortunately, this is an outcome of this war, and probably unavoidable. But anyway, if we'll speak about policies and about politics, so those who form this politics should be much more balanced in this case.
Thank you for your perspective. And the same question goes to about challenges and perspectives, trends, and Poland.
Well, I would say in general that in the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe, now we can see a very clear and unequivocal trend to accentuate, stress, highlight all facts, developments, occurrences, processes from history in which different nations repelled Russian invasion, Russian imperialism, fought with Russian imperialism, repelled aggression on the part of Russia in its different forms and embodiments over the ages, from the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, through the Russian Empire, through the Soviet Union, and now Putin Russia. And it is natural. We can see it, I think, not only in Poland, but in many other states of the region, not only in Poland, not only in Ukraine. Moreover, what is the challenge? I think that it's important not to exaggerate with this accentuation. We should not identify everything which comes from Russia with great Russian imperialism or with Russian chauvinism. For instance, we should not treat, I don't know, Pushkin, Russian literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky as something extremely negative, which should be counteracted, fought with in propaganda, in history textbooks, and so on and so forth. And I know that it's partly understandable, but there are even some cases in Ukraine nowadays that some people completely, totally, entirely reject everything which is connected with Russia to the extreme, which I think it's not imprudent. We should all keep in mind that being a dissident in a so authoritarian, brutal state like the Russian Federation is an act of enormous courage, and it was in the 20th century, in the 19th century too. So to some extent, we should be understandable vis-a-vis Russian society. However, all of us would like to see Russian society, Russian nation, much more proactive, opposing actively the Chekist regime, which is ruling undemocratically Russia, and basically which is driving Russia towards a kind of peculiar, weird suicide. I think in the long run, it's a suicidal policy, which may finally, ultimately, result in even the breakup of the Russian Federation.
Thank you for this your deep perspective. And I think, unfortunately, it's time to end our interesting discussion. And I think this session helped us, as also an audience, to analyze more deeply the implications of the politics of implications of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war for the politics of history and politics of memory in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you to our great panelists, great speakers for their valuable presentations. And thank you to all of viewers for their participation in this webinar. And of course, a special word of appreciation to my colleagues from the Institute of Central Europe, and in particular to Andrzej Koma for the support, for technical support, and in making this event possible. As I mentioned already during the webinar, a recorded version of the webinar will be available online soon. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the day.